Guys hear me now? Hello? Hi. Wow, I find it very flattering that 50 of you are spending your Sunday afternoons watching me here, and this is my first live stream. So thank you very much for watching, and I'm sorry if I make mistakes. That's probably just part of the whole system, and please tell me. So sorry about my camera. The one I normally use for my FaceTime videos doesn't work for live streams, but we'll make it work. So here are some ground rules from before we start. Okay, so I gave my patrons first dibs. So the first 7 questions I'm going to go through are questions that my patrons supplied to me. And don't worry if you have a great question. I'm reading this comment section and I'll note it and I'll come back to it later. And so, second general rule is that I know our comment sections. I don't want them to be like what it normally is, which is, please do my scenario, plus, 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 plus. And I don't want to just continually be answering blank, what if blank happened questions. So, and in general, I mean, everything else is open. If you want to talk about history, you want to talk about alternate history, philosophy, cooking, my time on the Appalachian Trail, literature, video games, politics, predictions for the future. In general, the more random your question, the more I'll like it and the more likely I am to answer it. So let's get started. Okay, the first question is, what are your political views? You seem to have a snarky word for everyone. And in general, I'd consider myself center libertarian right, and center is the key word there. I get along with everyone from around the political spectrum. And in general, if you're willing to be open to ideas and talk things through, then I'll be willing to talk to you. I have friends who are really into social justice, friends that are right-wing militarists, and they're both good people. In general, I don't really get along with people who think that their political views have a monopoly on the truth. And both sides are really guilty of that, and I just don't like that because the truth is so complicated and convoluted that I think that if you and your belief structures believe that you are the only person who knows what's going on in the world, that's just quite disingenuous. Okay. The second question is, what are your religious beliefs and views on Christianity? Well, talking about religion can be quite controversial, but so my father's side's Catholic, my mother's side's Protestant, and I was raised a Quaker. And but I left the church at a fairly young age, and now I'm a generic, non-conforming Protestant. I'm a huge fan of Stoic philosophy, and I use that as a way of, as a moral center, more than I do Christianity, sorry. And so I don't really attend churches, and my views on Christianity. So I think that to decry any one philosophy as entirely good or evil is a bit one-sided. And I think that philosophies, like, imagine if you met a Muslim man from Iraq and he was just continually decrying the evils of Islam and saying how Islam was the worst religion ever. And you would eventually tell him after a certain point, no, it's not Islam. It's a certain subsection of Islam that have warped it. And I believe a similar thing with Christianity. There was a French philosopher called Pascal Bruckner, who once said that it's not the West didn't do bad things, it's that everyone else has done bad things as well, but the West has done some extraordinary things. And that's how I feel about Christianity. It's done a lot of really bad things, but at the same time, it's done stuff like get rid of the gladiatorial games, get rid of slavery inside Europe, etc. I could go on. And okay, question number 3. What are your views on the alt-right in the alternate history community and other big alternate historians like Alternate History Hub, Monsieur Z, and the Alternate Historian? So I really don't like how the alt-right is getting more and more control inside the alternate history community, and I think it's a shame. People tend to view the alt-right as a joke, and then I just don't, it's much more dangerous than anyone ever really gives it credit for. There's a lot of pro-left-wing comments over there, and I can get to that later, but the alt-right, they're significantly more dangerous. They're taking over a larger and larger percentage of the alternate history community. And you see more and more channels taking more of a alt-right tint. And I find that quite worrying. I don't want to run into a situation in which being alt-right comes with the synonymous of being part of the alternate history community. And so I try my best to keep it more politically unbiased and all that sort of thing. So that's my general viewpoint. And for my views on other alternate historians, I honestly, I have very little interest in the community in general. I'm just trying to do my job. And I've met up with, well, from when I've worked with Matt Mitrovich, he seems like sorry, I never worked with him. I've communicated with him. He seems like a perfectly reasonable man. Monsieur Z, I did a podcast series with him. And that's before he came out with his politics. And for those of you who don't know, Monsieur Z is, he's another YouTuber of a similar size to our channel. And he has some white supremacist, vaguely politics that I don't agree with. And so I worked with him before he came out with that. But in general, I have no interest in starting drama with Monsieur Z. We're just people who are living our own lives. And Alternate History Hub, he's so much larger than any of the other channels that it's hard to really comment on the size of his channel or the content that's being put out because just the scale is so much different and so much larger. So any comment would come out either as obsequiousness or bitterness. Okay. Okay, question number 4. What is the best climate for civilization? And so I'd say there are about 2 answers. Most early civilizations were started in irrigation-based cultures in the desert because most societies were based around the need to maintain organization along complex irrigation systems. And they were around desert climates around 30 degrees north. So Egypt, the Indus Valley, Mesopotamia, the Valley of Mexico. So that's the area that's produced civilization. And the areas where civilization, I think, has thrived the most throughout an average throughout history would be the temperate climate around 40 degrees north. And in that climate, you've got the Roman Empire, you've got ancient Greece, the north of China, Japan, the middle of the United States. And so it's a climate that consistently has a lot going on. And it's hard to say why that would fully be. It's definitely because the temperate climates allow the diseases don't become a major issue in the same way they are in the subtropic climates. And so you don't have to deal with diseases killing large percentages of your population. And at the same time, you can get more resources than from the more further north Arctic climates. Okay, question number 5. What school of history do you belong to, and what is your opinion on great man history? And so in general, I disagree with any political theme of history, any political theory of history like the Whiggish theory of history, which is basically that history's been on an upward civilizational trajectory since the ancient Greeks, and it ends with the United States and the UK being the greatest civilization ever because they have freedom and all that stuff. And that seems politically biased to me, same as the Marxist theory of history and the postmodernist theories of history, which is basically that history is the tale of oppression and people in generally getting higher and higher levels of freedom. And again, I don't like philosophic theories of history because they tend to have too much into a single theory, and they try to not actually be an accurate representation of the world because they don't fully understand, because they keep on trying to put everything into a single overarching theory that's not an accurate representation of what's actually going on. And the theory I like best is it's not actually a scientific, it's not actually a historic model yet, but if you read the books that are coming out now, it's probably going to become one in several decades. I call it the evolutionary model. And it's the model that basically humans aren't that different from animals, and that you should study history from a biological and evolutionary standpoint, in that the areas that get more competition are the areas that are most likely to be able to succeed more, and that humans basically try to follow Darwinian and biological principles to survive, and you end up with greater and greater complexity, except rather than race being the determining factor, culture is. And this is the big issue the Nazis ran into, and why Nazi philosophy was so cruel and awful, was that they viewed race as the determining factor in history, and that one race was superior to the other. Well, the evolutionary model views certain systems and management styles as the most successful, and that those get replicated throughout history. Oh yeah, great man theory. So for those of you that don't know, the great man theory of history is basically that that single great figures determine history, and that like if you take Napoleon, and no matter what happens, Napoleon's going to be a great figure and derail history. And in general, that has some merit, but at the same time, it doesn't have complete merit. And you have to combine the different variables between a theory that takes account to leadership. So if Abraham Lincoln or Alfred the Great weren't there, history would change drastically. But at the same time, different talents are very important. And if the situation was different, a very talented person might have done something different and taken their talents in a different way, or that just history would have, the great demographic and cultural themes are still more important than the individual, I would say. Okay, number 6. What motivated you to start the channel and keep going despite complaints about your voice? So, in general, I started this channel because everyone around me was getting pissed off at me continually going on alternate history rants. And so I would just talk about what if World War II had gone differently, what if the Roman Empire never fell until the cows came home inside my own personal community. And so that would basically, I decided to take it online and get a fan base like you guys that would appreciate that sort of thing. And so I originally based it off the alternate history wiki guys. And I don't know about this. I don't know if you guys know about this, but alternate history wiki is a forum by which you deposit and make alternate history theories. There's some really incredible stuff there. At the same time, a lot of it is not that great. And so I thought, this is going to sound kind of arrogant, but I thought I can do it better than that. And so I decided to found this channel to basically do my own version of like a small alternate history wiki. And I had no expectations of anything greater when I started this channel. And I'm just glad I am where I am. And why didn't I care about complaints with my voice? In general, I'm a pretty self-reliant person, so I don't see why your comments affect my life. You just exist online. There's a big barrier between my personal life and my life out here. So I don't take a lot of your comments that far hard. I'll take criticism if it's rational and well stated. But if you're just some thug saying, "You racist, your voice bad, you evil, you do understand history," I'm not going to listen to you. My worst comment ever, I would say, someone once posted all the ships from the Atlantic slave trade that were owned by Jews in a single comment. And I was like, man, this guy's got to be a psycho. Does my channel have a schedule? I try to upload every 2 weeks, but life gets in the way, and I'd love to maintain a strict schedule, but I'm just not disciplined enough. And so that's what I aim for, but I get sick all the time. And so I try to make something every 2 weeks, then I'll get sick, then I'll be delayed a couple of days, then I'll work extra hard to make the next video. Then, I don't know, my cat dies. My life's weird. Okay. So, what's your commonly held belief about the past that most frustrates you? Oh, God, I've got a lot. So, the first one is that people tend to look down upon the past with scorn, which is something I really don't like. In general, people in the past were as intelligent as we are today. And the reason that we think people in the past were dumb is that we're putting our own value system on top of them. Well, in reality, they just lived in very different circumstances. Like a very interesting book I recently read, which is called Foragers, Farmers and Fuels. And it's written by Ian Mortimer. No, some other British professor who does philosophy writing. Or Ian Morris, that's it. And it basically says that your value system is determined based upon the energy source you use. And so hunter-gatherers have their own culture, farming peoples have their own culture and morals and mores and that sort of thing. And then industrialized peoples have their own culture and moral structure. And so a very interesting thing was he said that every pre-industrial people had some form of forced labor, whether slavery, serfdom, or forced corvée style of labor, because they had to maintain the structure of their society. And the same that he goes through some stuff that is quite shocking from our current perspective, but basically had to happen for those pre-industrial societies to function. So, and it also annoys me that a lot of people view war as a big football game or like Risk. An issue I see a lot of you make in the comments is that you think that you view war like Risk. So you'll say like, let's attack North America over Greenland. Or like War Plan Red was just filled with delusional people who were saying like the British would blitzkrieg America in the 1930s. And I'm like, do you understand how supply chains work and how big enormous nations are? And It's like an armed football game. Okay, so that's all the questions that I have. So new ones. What is your favorite history alt-hist channel or video? Hmm. So my favorite timeline in general is I made this way back. Was what if United America collapsed in the 18th century? Because I'm a huge fan of American cultural history, and so I thought it would very interesting rather than American history being the centralization of culture. If each different area with its own country and their own specialized culture and way of doing things, and it would have resulted in a very interesting effect. However, I don't like a lot of my older videos because I'm constantly improving. And so for actual quality, I would have to say my favorite video is What If England Won the 100 Years War? Because I just love the Middle Ages. I love talking about the Middle Ages. I love making maps for these videos. That's my greatest joy. And so that video is a lot of maps, and that was just a lot of fun. I'm doing all right. So, I mean, life's going well. This channel. Oh, sorry, didn't say that. How am I doing in the current climate of the world? I'm doing all right. So I'm a university student. So I have enough money to keep going. My channel's all right. I'm living the best life I can. So I have many complaints. Things could be worse. What do I think of Eurocentrism? So, in general, Eurocentrism is bad. People should give the different areas of the world the different importance they're due. And so I think that you should focus equally on China, the Middle East, India, Europe. However, Europe has been so dominant over the last 500 years that it does deserve extra attention for why it was so dominant over the last 500 years. So I think you could legit have more emphasis on early modern and late medieval Europe to explain Europe's later dominance alongside the Industrial Revolution. But if we're looking like 1000 AD, I think the Middle East, India, Europe, China all deserve equal emphasis. Do I think the US will collapse? I think the US is currently going through a crisis of leadership. What amounts to a religious war, honestly, where we're trying to figure out what our main value system is. And that's going to be very difficult. But in the end, I think we're going to pull through. And I don't think the US is going to collapse as a single entity because communications get better. And there's external competition. We're entering a world with more different great powers. So competition from China, India, Russia is going to force the US to stay united. However, over the next couple hundred years, I think like any large empire, the US is probably going to be more likely to split up. And I would think that California, possibly Texas, go their own ways and become their own countries. California, because they've got a huge mountains and deserts dividing them from the rest of the Union. And just geographically, they're more likely to go off in their own direction. Where in Canada am I from? And how was I born in the US or Canada? So I was born in the US. I've lived in Canada for part of my childhood because my parents divorced. Mother's Canadian, father's American. And I lived in southern Ontario, about 2 hours south of Toronto. Do you think any nations are going to split in the future? I definitely think Russia is probably going to go off in a lot of different directions because Russia is just in such a indefensible position. So I think that China, as global warming continues, is probably going to take over the Russian Far East because China is much more powerful than Russia, got more resources, and it depends a lot on what Russia's future leadership over the next couple of decades are. If Putin and his successor are able to expand Russia and create a new ideology rather than just cynical power hungriness, I think Russia has the potential to continue. But in possible great powers of the future, I'd probably put Russia as a solid number 5. What do you think about the website Alternate History and its effect on the alternate history genre? Do you mean alternate history wiki? Okay, I'll wait until you have an answer. I'll just go with alternate history wiki. Alternate history wiki is how I got started in alternate history. And for those of you that don't know, it's sort of like, it's a site where you make your own independent timelines and then put as much detail as you can into it. And you see all sorts of weird tropes on it that I think have got replicated throughout the alternate history genre. And those tropes, I mean, I fell into using these tropes quite a bit when I was an early YouTuber because it's just the way the genre works and your influences are who you are. So you'll have these enormous space-filling empires that make no sense geographically or ethnically. And you'll have like Turkestan, like all of Central Asia will unite for no reason. And you'll just have these weird countries that have no reason to exist just because you wanted to draw the map for them and make the flag. And in general, they have the empires lasting way too long. And they don't pay it. It's entirely military, no attention to cultural, economic, or social effects. Wow, a lot of new questions. How do you see the future of your channel? So, as I talked before, I'm big into Stoic philosophy. One of the big tenets of Stoicism is that you try your best and you just wait for the best possible option to happen. And that's my attitude. I'm just going to put the most I can as these videos, make them the best I can, and hope that they do well, because that's the only thing I have control over. I hope that I expand and continue to grow. I'm just going to keep doing what I do to a better quality, gradually, and improving the maps, improving the timelines, improving my speech, improving the microphones. The face cam was a big step forward that I thought would work. I was wrong. I take full credit for that. So next. Have you read Nick Gurr's World War II timeline in the Second World War? It's the second most read one. I have not read that. Boots Jew, you're commenting that quite a bit. Are you on Twitter? I am not on Twitter. One of you asked, and this is a question I get a lot, is I should start a subreddit. And I theoretically could. However, I have little interest in. I started Redditing a bit, but I find it very stressful because I feel the need to answer a question as thoroughly as possible. And on Reddit, where there are 50 different questions, it's very stressful and it's kind of overwhelming. So I never got into Reddit. I also don't like platforms that make you immediately respond. And that's part of the reason why I didn't like Discord so much. I prefer to more slowly and thoughtfully craft a product. And I don't like the constant action. I need time to rest and relax before I go on to my next project. What do you think Korean unification will be like? That's difficult. The Kim regime has lasted longer than I expected it would. However, I still expect the Korean peoples to unify because geography and ethnicity means that they're united. So, and it depends a lot on the great powers around them. I think China is going to try to get Korean unification because if they can get South Korea to be a Chinese vassal, then South Korea will be a much more stable vassal than the downright insane North Koreans. So that's an option. In general, it depends on if China and the US have a war, whoever wins that war would result in Korean unification. However, it is theoretically possible that North Korea could survive much longer if we continue in the sort of deadlock between the US and Chinese diplomacy, by which both sides will just support their own client states. Okay. Mike, I have two cats. One's named Alduin, the other's named Velika. They spend all their time outside hunting, and they hate me. They just kill mice, bring snakes in. Yeah, they really do hate me. But I mean, I love them back, and yeah. Do you think religion will rise or decay in the immediate future? Okay, immediate future is a very interesting term because it can mean a variety of things. But throughout history, people have needed certain ideologies to propel them forward. And ideology has to be a reflection of the society it's currently in. And so you've seen several religious revolutions throughout history. You saw the shift from hunter-gatherer-based religions like the Lord of the Beasts and animists, like worshiping trees in the forest and that sort of thing, towards farming fertility gods like Ishtar, and like basically killing your goats and virgins to make sure the fields grow again. Then you moved on to then you had like the Indo-Europeans with like Thor and Zeus and all those badass gods. Then you move on to the Axial Age religions, which are what we currently have, which is like Christianity, Islam, all that stuff, Confucianism, and they had to deal with a large Iron Age societies in which people have to meet other people that are similar. And but with the Industrial Revolution, we've had to develop a whole new slew of ideologies. So we're basically trying to invent new religions. And in my channel, I've referred to communism, Nazism, all those things, even social justice as religions, because they're all-encompassing ideological strains that tell people what to do. They give them broad meaning in the universe. They create a force of cosmic importance. And like, let's take communism. They've got the dialectic of history that says history will end up in a certain utopian heaven no matter what happens. And at the same time, they tell the individual what to do. They have faith, they have rights, they have like church ceremony, not church ceremonies, but like all of these ideologies are a way of bringing people together and giving them higher purpose. And we're going to see a lot of that in the future. And if you guys want me to continue, I can give you suggestions for what I think future religions could be. Bye-bye, Mateus Pinheiro. Bubblegum has been saying, what if Jeb Bush became an overlord of Earth quite a bit? And I would say he would lose power immediately to mass rebellion. Wow, in your opinion, what's the most influential point in history? That's a hard question. I would say the Indo-European invasions, because they created Europe's main society as is, and most European cultures now were based off Indo-European frameworks. They became the ruling class in India, and they introduced a chariot to China, which resulted in the unification of China. So I would say the Indo-European invasions, and we don't know exactly when that happened or who did it, but Indo-European Genghis Khan would be my most important figure. Why do you mention the alt-right in your videos, but you never mention leftists? I mention leftists all the time. I call social justice a religion. I mean, it's a deeply, I mean, I have a lot of good friends who are into social justice, warm-hearted people, but it can be a deeply irrational and orthodox philosophy that can do quite a bit of harm. But I think that both the far right and the far left, if they get a healthy orientation and are able to work with other partners inside the political system and stop being focused on virtue signaling and building up hatred, I think they can be forces for good. Do you think Eastern Europe will ever catch up with the rest of the continent? I mean, yeah, look at Poland, Latvia. Those countries have enormous economic growth rates. And I mean, I think that the countries that the Latin Eastern Europe, or the part that was part of the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages and has strong cultural connections to Western Europe, I think they'll be the same level as France, Germany in a couple decades. But I think Orthodox Europe or Romania, Ukraine, very different cultures, very different histories that aren't as aligned to the rule of law. That sounds really bad, but aren't as aligned to stable competition of interests as the old Latin societies. They might take longer. Can you do what if you knew? Oh God. What is your opinion of the Broadster boy? Calm down. What's your opinion on the world is heading for another 150 to 100 years of autocratic dictators? I think the world's headed down a very interesting direction in that. So technology allows so much more evil and societal control by those in power than anything before. So propaganda is much more easy to transmit. It's much more easy to control things people are saying, the way society works. And so society is going to have to make the decision between whether it will purposely protect freedoms or it'll become an autocracy. And different areas around the world are going to develop different solutions to that. But that's why 1984 is one of my favorite books, because it clearly shows what happens if, with the rise of technology and the ability to control the masses, that we would go down if we don't pay attention to personal freedoms, because it's just a slippery slope. How did you become interested in history? Answer already. Thank you, Mika History. You're a loyal fan. Okay. So, I mean, I started out being interested in mythology. I was interested in mythology ever since I climbed out of the cradle. And I loved Hercules. I loved Thor. I loved King Arthur, all those guys when I was a toddler. I mean, I like swords for a reason, goddammit. And so after that, I got into the Middle Ages because it really seemed awesome. The idea that there were people who were like Hercules, like King Arthur in actual histories. That got me into the Middle Ages. And then from there, why would you study Game of Thrones or Star Wars if they're a legit history that's as awesome or more awesome? And that's what got me into it. Could you explain the influence of Chinese culture in Japan, Korea, and Vietnam? Could you explain the influence of Chinese? You don't have to repeat it, partner. Okay, so That's complicated. So those countries, so Confucian civilization was able to build the unified bureaucratic country of China. And China is like the Jupiter of Asia. It's huge, it's all encompassing. And the Chinese are basically good at everything because there are so many of them and they've been around for so long. And so for the countries around China, there's no way they can take over China. And China is the only big influencer in the area. And so countries like Korea and Japan, when their local warlords wanted to expand their power, they took Chinese bureaucrats, they took on Confucianism to manage their societies and tell them what direction their societies should go into. And so those societies, because China was the only influencer and a huge influencer in the area, got a huge amount of Chinese culture. Where did you get your knowledge of history and cultural events from? I read a lot. I repeat, I read a lot. Just when I was waiting for this video, I left this here. This is okay. Wow, there's a lot of you in the comments. Opinion of the EU army. Okay. I'm honestly not optimistic because Europe is rife with so much internal argument that it's hard to develop a single lead that everyone will agree on. And once America removes from power, the national differences will become more pronounced again. Or not once, if America becomes removed from power. So in a union of the European states, people worry about Germany becoming too powerful and trying to create a middle Europa. The UK will always want to play off its old settler societies versus the Europeans with the most power and cause distrust. France will... France might be a good option, but as for leadership, but they're weaker than Germany. And so Germany would not want French generals to lead German troops once Germany has gotten over its World War II guilt. And those are the three big countries that could provide leadership. And so I'm honestly not optimistic at Europe's ability to maintain as a unified, cohesive force if the American imperium goes away because of internal division. What do you think will happen in future Cold War between the U.S. and China? God, this is something I've studied a lot, and it's really depressing because if you look at the history of the world, war is fairly common. And in general, a situation that provides quite a bit of war is that between a dominant power they call it Thucydides' trap, and that there's a rising power and a dominant power. And when the rising power reaches a certain level of importance and power, the dominant power will try to crush it. And out of the 15 examples of that in the last 500 years, 12 have resulted in war. And so that leaves me very worried. And we're getting to a position where missile systems are good enough that a major war between the great powers would not result in Armageddon and the end of mankind. So in 1980, a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and Russia would result, the Soviet Union and the United States would result in around 1 billion deaths. Now a nuclear exchange between the great powers would result in around 300 million. And once you include countries like India, China, all those, wars can still be fought. And so that's very, very worrying. And the scale of death and destruction with our new technologies and with our new technologies and with the huge populations we have is just horrifying. So like Germany had a population of 60 million in World War II. Britain had, I'm guessing, 40 million. And meanwhile, China's got 1.4 billion. India's got 1.2 billion. The US has got 300 million. So if a major war were to break out between the great powers, it would be the most horrifying thing imaginable. It would be beyond what is imaginable horrors. I don't know what Dravidian assimilation means. If you could relive the life of one historical figure, who would it be? It would be Cortez. I would take over the Aztec Empire and I would try to do a more humane job of creating modern Mexico. I would try to prevent the native populations from being enslaved. I would try to prevent the Spanish Inquisition from being placed in there. I would try to introduce schools. I would just try to make a more humane Spanish state in the New World. And I mean, the descendants of the conquistadors, they're still big landowners and wealthy today in Mexico. And so my kids would be set forever. Um, do you think you're ever going to run out of timelines? No, I make timelines faster than I can put them out. There are just so many. And if I ever ran out, you guys would supply me with about 200 in each video. So I'm never running out until it could be 4000 AD and I'd still be putting these out. I don't know enough about India to answer your question of Dravidian assimilation. What would England look like if it was part of the HRE? That doesn't make sense with supply chains. Top possible superpowers. Okay. So my primary one is that India, I think the United States is still going to be number one due to enormous technological, geographic, and cultural advantages. The U.S. is the least offensive power to be an ally with because the United States is the one that's least likely to demand a lot from its client states, and it's huge. It's got a lot of industry. After the U.S., I'd say China. China has consistently been a great power over basically the whole of history. And the big thing that held China back was its geography, which cut it off from the rest of the world. And after China had the century of humiliation of the Opium Wars, the Taiping Rebellion, all that stuff, it forced China to realize the rest of the world mattered and could hurt China. And so I think that China is going to become a very powerful force in that section of Asia. The Communist Party they've done quite an intelligent job of getting China in 40 years from being a third-rate power to a first-rate power. And I think that's one of the biggest shifts in all of history. After China, I think it's Turkey, actually. Turkey has the potential to become the leader of the Islamic world, and that's the direction Erdogan's trying to put it towards, because the Islamic world's kind of interesting in that loyalties are U-shaped and that national loyalties are quite weak, but tribal loyalties and religious loyalties are quite strong. So the average Iraqi Muslim views himself as his local ethnic designation, like let's say Alawite, and then as a Shia. And so the Turks, if they were able to, could be able to become the leaders of the Sunni world and reinstate a sort of caliphate. And they're currently in the process of doing that, where they're invading Libya, they're invading Syria, and they control the headwaters of the Tigris and the Euphrates, meaning that they could take over Iraq at will if they wanted to. After Turkey, I would say India. India is huge. India's huge, got huge multiplicity of peoples and talents. India's got a lot of issues with its, if China dams up the Himalayas, that could result in a lot of issues. And creating unity between the different parts of India will also be difficult. But if India has good leadership, they have great potential to be a great power. After India, I would say Russia. I've got loads of others after this, but the two really interesting ones I don't see anyone else see coming, or three actually. The first is Ethiopia. I think Ethiopia has got the potential to become a great African power, considering the African country with the longest history of a bureaucratic civilization, and that I think, and the local countries around them are fairly weak. So if Ethiopia wants to, and the geopolitical situation changes, I think they could take over large parts of Africa and become a powerhouse. And Ethiopia is currently industrializing. They're currently they're building train lines to Djibouti. They're building their own naval force, even though they don't have a coast, to fight out the Somali pirates. And after that, another interesting one is, I think France and Germany, if they team up and find a détente and recreate Charlemagne's empire, they have great potential. The issue is declining birth rates, but France has still got a large pseudo-colonial empire in Africa that they can pull on. And I think that's less likely, but I think France and Germany teamed up still have quite a bit of potential. And my final one is the Congo, actually. So the way things generally work in history is that a great empire conquers a part of the world, then that empire creates a civilization. And I think that we could see in the next couple hundred years a sort of African civilization develop, run by an African Harun al-Rashid or Charlemagne, and that could be the equivalence to and I think the Congo is the most likely for that, because it's kind of the hinge of Africa, with the Congo River going, splitting the continent. And basically, if you have to get anywhere through Africa, you have to go through the DRC. So if someone were to be able to unify the DRC and then find a way to make the Congo River a united trading system, that they would have enormous power. Yeah, I know the Congo's got very high corruption and it's in a bad situation now, but there are lots of countries that a couple decades ago just appeared hopeless. Like Korea was poorer, one of the poorest nations on earth. Now Korea is one of the wealthiest. And so once you figure out a combination inside your society that allows you to grow an industrial society, you'll do well. And so I don't think the countries that are poor now are direct indicators of the ones that'll be poor in 200 years or so. Trump versus Biden. I'm not getting into that. I mean, I choose Cthulhu. I love the T-shirt that says Cthulhu 2020. Worst, choose the worst. I mean, it's such a bad decision. I mean, you're choosing between a senile old man and I mean and Trump, who's got many different issues. Trump worries me quite a bit for reasons that I don't want to turn this to a Trump rant video. So I'll probably just go libertarian as a protest vote. What do you think could have happened if Japan conquered Korea and parts of China during the samurai invasions? That's something that I've always wanted to make a video on, but I didn't know enough about Japan, and I never really got onto it, but expect that video to come soon. Do you think the US is prepared for a major cyber attack? If not, I want to hear your opinion. Yeah, cyber warfare is one of those things that it's like, it's definitely an enormous threat, and no one takes it seriously because our leadership's all boomers who don't know how to turn on their computers. But definitely it's something that's very, so I'm sure a lot of you know about logic bombs, which are basically codes that are inserted inside other nations' infrastructures to detonate upon command. And so let's say China has logic bombs inside the US's East Coast electrical system. So if war were to break out with China, the US East Coast electrical system just goes down. And so that's a huge threat. But in general, I think the US probably has got a very good cybersecurity system because the US has got the world's strongest tech sector, and the US military is very well funded. Also, an interesting thing to look at is we know about Russia, Iran, China's cyber warfare because they've lost at certain things, and then the US media spits it out. Well, meanwhile, the US has no similar losses that the Russians or the Chinese have tried to pull out for propaganda purposes, which is a very good sign in my opinion. But cyber warfare is something that we should be very worried about. A wise man once told me, the next war is going to be the most advanced things in the world versus the least advanced, and that we have the capabilities to lower ourselves to a base level of warfare, while at the same time having incredible capabilities. For example, the factories that make the current tanks that are absolutely amazing, that they can kill like 13 World War II era tanks because of the armor and their computer software, they're only made in a handful of factories. So if the enemy were to destroy those several factories, it would mean that we would have a limited number of these advanced tanks. We'd have to go back to World War II era technology. And so it would be kind of like Achilles in the Iliad, who would just be able to take out large amounts, but you only get one Achilles. Or similarly, if the Chinese or a foreign power or something else were to knock out our electrical grids, the people back at home would be fighting living a really base level life, like in the 19th century. But at the same time, the technologies that would be available would be unbelievably advanced. How would Turkey change if the Greeks never got genocided? I'd like to point out the Greeks were never genocided. They were forcefully evicted, which is not nice, but it's different. I mean, the Greeks were the merchant class of Western Turkey. So I think that Turkey might have a larger economy, but I really don't know enough to really give a conclusive answer. And Turkey would have to be a more pluralistic society rather than relying on Turkish nationalism. So it'd probably be nicer to the Kurds. Have you ever done the kind of Western cooking you described in the No Slavery video? So you mean, have I ever done medieval cooking and traditional cooking? Of course. I mean, it's so much fun. I got a medieval cookbook. I love doing old-timey recipes. And it's just a completely different cooking philosophy from the one we have today, where it's much more reliant on fats and much more reliant upon like small amounts of spices than it is in our current style. But medieval cooking is just a lot of fun. Like, stews, lots of meat dishes. The big boring thing in medieval cuisine, which is something they ate a lot, was they had a lot of different kinds of just pottages, which is like porridge mixed with very like porridge mixed with meat, mixed with vegetables. And so the upper classes would eat these really expensive porridges, basically. And I never really got into that. If you could alter one event in human history, what would it be? That's a tough one. Yeah, that's really, really tough. Let me get back to you on that one. Can you give book recommendations? What do you want? Do you want history, nonfiction, fantasy, literature? I read everything, so whatever book recommendations you want, I can give. What if World War III? What would World War III look like without nukes? Harry Turtledove's got an interesting book that looks at what would happen if war broke out between the U.S. and the Soviet Union in 1951, before hydrogen bombs were invented and nukes could just take out a couple blocks in a city. And neither side had a lot of nukes. That's a really enlightening book series. I forget its name exactly, but it basically, the Soviets drive to the Rhine, the U.S. builds up defenses and then slowly grinds the Soviets back. The U.S. had a larger economy and population, and so would have been able to gain an advantage over time. And if the Soviets won in the early stages of the war, they would have won. Best book in the Twilight Saga. I would say New Moon is the best. They have the New Moon had the least bland characters, best romantic aspects, etc. No, I know nothing about Twilight. What do you think about Trudeau? Okay, so I'm going to say I am Canadian Conservative Party, so I am naturally biased against Trudeau. I think he is quite corrupt. The Lavaland scandal was just absolutely demeaning, and it shocks me that he stayed in power after that. And I honestly, he spends a huge amount of Canada's income, which I don't think is good either. And he seems to do quite a bit of posing to appear good to the rest of the world. But that's my 2 cents. Believe whatever you want to believe. Is the U.S. basically bred in Panem et Circenses? Is the U.S. basically bred in circuses? At certain things, yes. I would say our politics is quite entertainment-based. But we're not a welfare state, which is basically what bread and circuses entails. And bread and circuses were not late Roman levels of corruption, in which basically in the late Roman Empire, people running for Senate would just give out bread in the streets to get votes. And that's not the US yet. What's your favorite types of music? In general, I listen to heavy metal and I listen to folk and old-timey country. I don't like new country. I mean, just for music, I'm sure a lot of you know this band. So I like my favorite artist, I'd say, is Stan Rogers. He's a Canadian folk singer. He sings long songs about Canadian history and the life of the Canadian working classes. I like Tyler Childers a lot. He's an American country singer. He makes old-timey country. A lot of songs about hardship and love and murder and all that stuff. Good stuff. And I'm a big fan of the Mongolian metal scene, actually, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of The Who. But I like Nine Treasures quite a bit. I like Tenger Cavalry, all very amusing bands. Of course, I like Sabaton. I like their history stuff, but I don't actually think they're that talented as a musical group. To hear about "Then the Winged Hussars Arrive" is just so much fun. Okay, thoughts on Nigeria and Indonesia. Okay, so neither should really be a country. Both were created for European powers and are complex ethnic coalitions that are basically empires. And a lot of them are run out of their capitals, I would say. Like, this is true of a lot of Latin American countries where the capitals treat the provinces with scorn and treat them like imperial domains. That's my impression for both of those countries. And I think Islamic Javanese control of Indonesia is getting more powerful. And actually, I take back what I said, Indonesia. They're moving their capital to Borneo. And so they're trying to get it away from Jakarta because Indonesia's got the issue where 60% of their population is based out of Java. And Java is probably only 15, 20% of the landmass. And so they're moving Javanese out to the provinces to try to solidify control of Indonesia, but they don't have the navy to be what they are, which is an island domain. Indonesia is also huge. On a map, it's longer than the horizontal length of the continental United States. And Nigeria, also a surprisingly huge country, it's a bizarre. So the Igbo and Yoruba peoples, before the Europeans arrived, they were city-states. They were pretty advanced. Well, meanwhile, the Hausa to the north were slaving horseback nomad tribes. So it'd be the equivalent of putting the Mongols, Russians, and Germans into a single country and telling them to figure stuff out. And it's impressive. If you could, you're asking me the question of what I would alter in human history. Part of me wants to say get rid of Karl Marx, but it wasn't him. It wasn't his philosophy. It was the people who took it after him that have more responsibility. Oh, I know. I would make sure that I would get rid of Al-Ghazali, so the Muslim world would have gone down more of an intellectual, rational route, and so the Muslim world would have stayed in its golden age and become a technological haven. And so the West and the Muslim world would have both been rationally and technologically based and would have competed with each other. That would make hundreds of millions of lives better. Okay. Do I play Paradox Interactive games? I've played several. I've played parts of Crusader Kings, and I've played Europa Universalis. I never really got behind them. I don't like games that are that complex, and the learning curve is huge, and I was just too lazy to learn the whole parts of each games. I'm a huge fan of, my favorite strategy game of all time is Rise of Nations. It was a game that came out in like 2003. It's Civilization, basically, but for an RTS. And I just think it's a brilliant game. It's so much more genius than anyone gives it credit for. Something that really stroked my ego was I read a scientific study that said that people who played Rise of Nations are statistically more intelligent and have better problem-solving systems than the rest of the population. So that made me feel good about myself. I like Total War a lot too. I really don't like the trajectory of Total War games in that I think medieval and Rome were the apex of the battles. And since then, the battles have sort of become dumber. And medieval, you'd have a 20-minute epic battle where you have to hold the line, you have to do real strategy. And then Warhammer Total War, just a troll runs up and breaks your infantry line in 30 seconds. And there's not a lot of strategy in that. However, the actual campaigns have been getting better, where I just love the units in medieval. I love how you can have an army of like a Griffin Knights fighting against dragons, fighting against demons, and just the campaigns are becoming more epic, while the battles are becoming weaker and less hardcore. Can I support your channel? I have no money to support your stuff on Patreon. I mean, you're supporting my channel now. You're watching my stuff. I mean, if you click on my ads, you give me money. I mean, this isn't all about the money for me. If you watch my videos, like my stuff, appreciate my content, you're supporting me. What economic theory do I subscribe to? So this is true for me in general. I don't subscribe to any one thing. I'll subscribe to like 60% to one theory, and then I'll take all sorts of stuff from other theories. And so in general, I'd say I'm a classical liberal. I think that markets should be free. I think that there should be as little regulation as possible. But I think the primary purpose of the economy should be to help people. So I don't think like multinationals or big companies should be allowed to oppress people. I think that there should be regulation, because that without a perfect libertarian economy would just result in anarchy, which would become a feudal state as people would try to get protection. And I mean, the Atlantic slave trade happened because there was no regulation against capitalism, because capitalism naturally has no morality. And so you either have to have a very, very strong moral system or a government to balance out capitalism's naturally amoral tendencies. And one of the things people don't realize is that the same people that move civilization forward are oftentimes sociopaths. They're greedy people. So I mean, like, war and greed are the two things that have brought the most progress to mankind, and at the same time brought the most evil. These are the things people will chant themselves for. And so the way you bring the world forward isn't you don't sit in a circle and sing kumbaya. You have to basically hijack these aggressive people and then use them for the benefit of society. Is Western Canada potentially on its way out of the Federation? I would say Canada's time for when it would have split up is past. Canada is becoming a wealthier country. It's becoming more integrated around the Central Toronto scheme, I would say. The Quebecois are happy with their payments they're getting. I mean, I think in a couple hundred years, Canada's probably going to become annexed by the US because the two are so culturally similar, at least Anglo-Canada. But I think as of now, Canada's probably going to be fine. What's the next border change? So, I could be like Emperor Tiger Star and draw something bizarre like saying Socotra will join the UAE. But, it's going to be, I think Asia is going to erupt into something very nasty and violent in the near future. So we're probably going to get a lot of changes in the next couple of years, but I don't fully know what direction it'll happen in. So, I mean, you could see Korea unite. You could see Taiwan join the PRC. You could see, there are so many things that could happen. I mean, I think Scotland, there's a fair chance Scotland might leave the UK, or the north of Ireland might join Ireland. I mean, there are so many possible borders because over the last couple decades, we've seen the UN basically sanctify the nation state, or the state, and say the borders that are currently existing must stay the same, and changing borders is immoral. And that's just a system that's not going to last forever. And in the next few decades, you're just going to see huge shifts on borders everywhere, except North America and Western Europe. War between China and India. I mean, they're both trying to get water, and they're running out of water in the Himalayas. And so you're seeing China dam up the Himalayas. And that's very worrying because both countries need the Ganges and the Yangtze. And it's just scary. Britain's my favorite part of British history. I mean, I love Vikings. I love the Anglo-Saxons. My favorite part of history in general is the early Middle Ages, and so that's my favorite part of British history. Wow, these are coming in so fast. What do you think about IQ as a measurement of intelligence? So I have average IQ. I mean, I don't mean maybe sound arrogant, but I'm a pretty smart guy. And so IQ measures certain things. Like I'm not good at math. I've never been a super good student. And so IQ is a very certain measurement of intelligence, but other things cannot be measured by IQ. So IQ has been proven to exist and have certain variables, but I don't think it's everything. And an interesting thing to look at is that different ethnicities, as they prove their lot in society, have raised IQs. So the Jews, the Poles, the Italians, all those groups started out with really low IQs 100 years ago, but as they integrated into American society, had IQs equal to or above the average American IQ. So I don't think IQ is exactly what we say it is, but I think it's very important. What do you think the religions of the future are going to be like? Okay. This is going to be a long one. So, okay. One of them is definitely going to be a form of like Pangeist environmentalism, in that people are going to, so humanity has to realize its potential as a guardian of the whole planet and our duties towards the environment. And that's going to take a certain environmentalist tone where there are going to be people who believe the earth to be a single organism, and said organism is a living thing, and we need to do what the earth says, basically. And that could be helpful in certain ways. In other ways, it could result in radicalism where people hate mankind and do all sorts of dumb stuff. Like a big issue I have with the environmentalist movement today is I think a fair portion of it isn't actually helping the environment. It's about chest beating to show that you're a righteous person. And another possible religion, I think, could be people will start to worship computers, because a lot of it, I think, something bad that a lot of religions end up doing is taking responsibility away from the individual. And I don't think that's inherent inside religion. But people will start to think that once computers get advanced enough, that the computers have greater wisdom than humans. And so people will create these enormous computers, and then listen to what the computers have to say without any questioning. And they'll think the computers hold a higher mission. And so that's an interesting belief. Something that really, really, really worries me, and the alt-right is currently on this route, is that we could develop an evolutionary-based religion where the desire to basically become the Ubermenschen and raise humanity to its next level of development, probably with biological engineering, could become a religion. And that could do really good things by improving mankind and making it a better species. But at the same time, it could get derailed by all sorts of racists and that type to be a justification for genocide. And because we have so much biological potential in us, I could see the return of Nazi-style philosophies. And at the same time, the left's belief that everything is a societal construct, gender, race, all that stuff, that it has no biological existence. I mean, it's scientifically disproved if you look at a lot of the new studies coming out, and so that's going to backfire quite a bit, and it'll go the other direction. And I don't want us to end up with a Nazistic style religion. And what I think a healthy new religion we could develop is, so a big worry that we've had with all sorts of ideologies after the Industrial Revolution that have tried to fill the new religious void is that they lack a higher judge, which is the reason I'm religious. I think that ideologies and religions need to have a belief structure by which the judging in which there's morality that is higher than humanity, because if humanity is the judge of its own morality, that means that whatever we say is fine. And if whatever we say is fine, it creates a justification for everything. And so, but I don't think you actually need God. I think you could develop a pseudo-Zoroastrian philosophy by which there is good and evil, and that the constant struggle between the two of them is existent in the physical world. And with that philosophy, you could develop, the two of them and kind of are able to create the world and improve themselves by that competition. And so you end up with a situation in which good is better, and that the world is constantly improving, and that after a certain point we get to heaven. What's the name of the song in my intro? It's from, I use Adobe software. It's called Endgame. No connection to Marvel. Do you think the Typing Rebellion could have succeeded? And what would that world look like? So, yes, I think it could. The Typing Rebellion's a really interesting war. I'm trying to read up more of it. Autumn in the Heavenly Kingdom by Stephen R. Platt is one of my favorite books of all time. I definitely think it could have happened, and that's going to be a future video. I don't want to go into all the details now. Could the Arab world unite? I would say yes, but probably not with the current leadership. So a lot of the Arab countries haven't been led by their own native regimes before the 1950s since the 5th or 6th centuries BC. They've been run by foreigners. And so the Arab world has in general been run by non-Arab forces, even well united. So I think the Turks or the Persians or the Berbers, maybe in some bizarre world, could be able to unite the Arab world. And the Arab world is naturally unified, I would say, throughout most of history, because irrigation systems are more predicated towards unity because of their state by which a single person controlled the water systems. And so that's why the last time Egypt was disunited was 2000 BC. Thank you, je ne sais quoi. Thoughts? What do you think about Friedrich Nietzsche? So I've never actually read a Nietzsche work, which is strange because I love philosophy. But I think he's got a lot of really interesting and smart ideas. But again, I think he thinks too highly of himself. I think that he's like Marx in that he develops these ideas that could be true, but at the same time, he doesn't understand human nature and how human nature works. So I think he understands how Darwinism would result in a shift in the way we view religion. But at the same time, I don't think he believes in the Ubermenschen, which I think is an interesting idea, in that humanity can now improve itself and make better humans. But at the same time, he doesn't understand human nature, by which all the evil that could come out of that. And actually, he does talk about that, but he offers no solutions for it. Bruh, libertarianism has never worked. I'm not a libertarian. I am a classical liberal. That's why I said I was center-right libertarian, emphasis on the center. I'm more of a centrist than anything. I think any philosophy pushed to the extremes is not an accurate representation of the world because the world's so complicated that a single theory can't fully encompass it. Do you speak or read any other languages? I speak French. I speak French quite well. I can read in French. I can talk in French. I can watch French TV. I can also read in Latin. Do you know of any anti-technological movements besides the Luddites in history? The Taoists were anti-technology when they started. There were a lot of anti-technological movements in 6th century India, which believed that technology would just result in an increase in population, which would in turn just result in starvation. A lot of the modern world's anti-technology, or a lot of the cultural aspects of the modern world's anti-technology, and then there are people who want to, like the anti-vaccine, anti-GMO crowd. Both of those, but GMOs have allowed the world's population to quadruple, and vaccines have fought illness in so many different ways. So that's a fear of technology. And a lot of people who talk, the old timers mostly, who talk about how technology is going to ruin the younger generation. I mean, in a lot of ways, technology has changed our social interactions, but I think it's mostly for the best. Like, I mean, I'd never have this job. I'd just be some nerd reading where I'm from without the internet. Could the Qing dynasty feasibly reform and survive? Yes, but it would be very, very difficult. The Confucian bureaucracy had been a limit to China's reform from around 800 after that. And so the Qing bureaucracy would have to have been able to find a way to combat the Confucian bureaucracy and create another source of power they could have based itself upon. And so if the Manchu nomadic elite had been able to ally themselves with like the merchants or some other force in Chinese society, they could have reformed, but that would have been very difficult. If Hitler was born in the 21st century, would he hate Muslims or Jews? Okay. It's difficult. I don't really know enough about Hitler's internal character to know what his driving motivations are, because there are so many different ways that the personality can manifest depending on your era. Do you think a scramble for China could have occurred before World War I? I would say no. China is just such an old and advanced and bureaucratic civilization that I don't think that it would be possible to just easily divide. And China has just such a huge population that I think that they would just keep rebelling. And it was the Westerners, if they wanted to exploit China, as they did, they should have done it to the Qing monarchy. And a lot of you are going to say India, but say India is the case against that. But India is much more divided in on itself, in that there are all sorts of different Indian realms like Gujarat, Malwa, etc. And so the idea of a common Indian nation didn't exist for the 1930s. There was an Indian civilization, but not an Indian nation. And China has been China has been a single nation for the last 3,000 years. And at the same time, an interesting thing is, in the same Indian villages, different castes have 3 times the genetic difference between them as between North and South Europeans, because India it's divided on so many different levels. And India's got so much potential, but I think that's the biggest weakness inside India that prevents it from becoming a great power. Do I think World War I could have been prevented? I would say no. So the general trajectory of European history after the fall of Rome was that all these successor states wanted to recreate the Roman Empire, and so they were always trying to unite Europe, and their continued failure is the main driver of European history. And so that's why you see all these countries with the eagle as their symbol. Even the early United States was trying to recreate the Roman Empire, but so the European countries were always trying to unite Europe. And that improved their technology. And then it was an arms race. And the end of that arms race was the World Wars, which resulted in the United States taking over the Western world. And It reminds me a lot of Carroll Quigley, who's a historian philosopher. He's got a theory of civilization in that you have an age of conflict where all these powers fight each other and try to unite the civilization. And then once the age of conflict is over, you get a universal empire, which ushers in a golden age of peace and stability throughout the empire. And as an American, that sounds totally self-congratulatory, and it is, but it rationally makes sense. Do you think the French would turn to extremist ideology if they lost World War I? I mean, everyone who lost World War I did. And after the first, and I mean, remember, France's democratic history before the First World War wasn't that long. So they got rid of the emperor in 1871. And their democratic history before then was fitful at best. I mean, even during the revolution, it was not a stable democracy. They were killing people left and right. It was a murderous state. So I would say France could have easily turned in a right-wing direction. Harry Turtledove's got something very interesting when he had that the French lose World War I, and that he had right-wing monarchist fascists take over with like extreme Catholic views. And I mean, that sounds interesting. And the trial of Dreyfus is very interesting, and it showed the right-wing forces in France inside the time, and just how deep the reactionary forces could have been if France lost the First World War, and how strong patriotism was inside France. Do you think Brazil can improve and turn into a superpower? So I'm inherently an idealistic person. I think if things put their minds to it, they can improve themselves. However, Latin America in general and Brazil, they've had 500 years, and they've tried all sorts of different things, and they still have not improved themselves. The big issue is that power is centralized inside the single landowning class, and breaking away from that landowning class is remarkably difficult, because you need to develop a new productive class to replace them. And what normally happens is that the new regime just fills the old one's boots. So what happened in Bolivia when they got rid of the landowners and the encomiendas was that the communist party that took over in Bolivia, they just had their local commissars take over the old land holdings. What happened similar to Mexico, when they removed the old land holdings, they gave them new government buddies. And so you need to develop a pluralistic system by which multiple forces compete. And the really sad thing is, when you in societies where there's only one strong power base, when you try to replace said power base, you oftentimes just get the same old thing, but with new faces. So what happened in Liberia when the black slaves were brought over from the United States to create their own free state, is that the black slaves recreated the American South and Liberia with them as the slave owners and the Africans as the slaves. And actually, the native Liberians called the American settlers the white men, and said that they dressed and danced like it was in Virginia. And it's just one of those sad things in history when you just see hundreds of years with little reform. And like, that's why the Roman Empire, whenever they would get in a new general, they would just fill the shoes of the old general, because unless you have multiple sources of power, when you try to remove the one source of power, it just springs up again. What's your favorite alt-hist scenario that wasn't yours? So I'm a big fan of Harry Turtledove, and my two favorite books by his I'd say the top of my favorite is the World War I, because I'm a big fan of science fiction, and I just love the aliens fighting over the aliens in World War II. It was just so badass. I'm shocked it's not become a strategy game. And the second one I would say would be Harry Turtledove's World War I series, or no, Civil War series set in World War I. I don't like the series after World War I because I think it's unrealistic, and I think the Union probably would have annexed the South, and he's just trying to add in too many Hitler tie-ins with like Jake Featherstone and the Confederacy, where I don't think he's just trying to recreate Nazi Germany inside the American South. And I think that he should have used more imagination. And besides Harry Turtledove, my two favorite alternate history books, I would say, one would be Bring the Jubilee, which is a very interesting book, and it's about a world where the South won the Civil War, which is my favorite basic alternate history, I would say. And it's a world where the South beat the Union, and then the South took all these retribution money, and the South became the dominant economy in North America and industrialized, while the the North became the North became a Latin American country basically, and cycled in debt and poverty and all that stuff, which I don't think is an accurate scenario. But my family's parts of my family is from the South, and the South did really badly after the Civil War. And I think it's an interesting analysis to look at what would happen if the North faced conditions similar to the South after the Civil War. And it's about this young guy who is a smart guy. He's just trying to improve himself in the world. And in the North's corrupt, broken system, he just keeps on failing. So he basically decides to just work at a bookstore and try to ignore the world as much as possible. That's a really depressing but good alternate history. And the second one, actually my favorite history of all time, is S.M. Sterling. I don't like most of his books, The Peshawar Lancers. And it's set in a world where in 1878, a comet hits the Earth. And so the world basically stuck in the 1880s for the next 200 years. So this is set, 150. So this is set in 2020. And it's in a world where the British Empire still controls quite a bit of the world. And it's an adventure story with a lot of fantasy elements where they have to basically save the world from being destroyed, and there's magic. And I grew up reading a lot of Kipling and watching The Man Who Would Be King. I know Mandalay by heart. It reminded me quite a bit of Kipling's poetry, and it was a fun adventure. So I've been getting a lot of questions on what my religious background is. I've already answered that. Go to the front of the video when this is done. I was raised a Quaker. I'm a generic nonconformist Protestant. I'm a big fan of Stoic philosophy. Favorite food? There's a very good beef stew called a gardien. It's beef stew or bowl stew cooked in red wine, and it's served with rice. It's just excellent. And besides that, I like chocolate lava cake. It's a French dish. Who the hell is Ted? Okay, you're asking about Canadian hockey. I'm not a sports guy. Pierogies are good food. Thoughts on Alternate History Hub? Alternate History Hub is so much bigger than me that nothing I say will come across as good. I'm sure a majority of you are fans of Alternate History Hub. Future thoughts of the Northwest Passage. Speaking for the Canadians out there, for just one time I would take the Northwest Passage. Sorry, that's a famous Canadian song, unofficial national anthem. I think the Northwest Passage will be quite important trade as climate change continues. And I think we're going to see a lot of Canadian cities develop on the north up there. And the polar front could be a possible option if we have a major war in the near future between Russia and the United States. And a really interesting thing is I heard plans to build a space elevator up in central Ontario, north of all the cities and stuff. And so if you have a space elevator and the Northwest Passage, that could turn the north of Canada into a very important area. Thoughts on history lessons in the educational system. So I was raised in the U.S.'s educational system. And in the U.S., we've got this big crisis of leadership by which we don't know. The right and the left have very different narratives on history. And so we're unsure of which narrative to pick. And so between that, not a lot of history actually gets taught. And so we have this thing called social studies, which basically, like, they'll talk about the symbolic importance of the flag rather than actually telling history. And I think that's very damaging to the nation because people don't actually know their history, and they're going into the world feeling like not knowing of their heritage and their background and all that stuff. And so I think we should legit teach actual narratives and facts. And when history is taught, they tend to make it pretty boring and view it as a single teleological narrative where everything that happened had to happen. And that's just not an accurate view of history. An accurate view of history is deeply dramatic. Everyone involved is trying their best. It's a crazy world. And just so many different options can happen. That's the big thing with alternate history is it teaches you that at any single moment, 60 different things can happen. The world can go in so many different directions. And so the world isn't just a boring narrative and timeline. It's endless potentiality. Any book recommendations in the Fall of Rome? Actually, the Fall of Rome is my speciality in history, so I have a huge amount. So anything written by Peter Brown is very good. Peter Brown's Introduction to Late Antiquity is excellent. Gibbon is a very good writer. However, his style doesn't fit very well with the modern world. And so Gibbon also only talks about politics. And so read Gibbon if you have the time, if you have the attention span. I'm a person with a very long attention span. I read Will Durant, who is a really thick writer, but I just couldn't get through Gibbon. So Gibbon's excellent. Other books of the late Roman Empire. I've heard very good things about Empires and Barbarians. That's by Peter something. I'm forgetting exactly his name. Yeah. I saw the thick writer comment. You were a degenerate. What is the best post-crisis Roman emperor, or best late Roman emperor? I know I've shit a lot on Diocletian and Constantine, but I would have to say those guys, because all the guys after them are just absolutely terrible. And those guys are able to recreate the Roman system so that it would survive for another 150 years. And so, because the Roman Empire at the end of the crisis of the 3rd century was in terrible shape, and Diocletian and Constantine were able to recreate the Roman Empire in a new form that was super oppressive and eventually destroyed itself, but it was able to keep the empire going for another 150 years. And you have to give them some credit for that. By the way, guys, I'm stopping this at the 1.5 hour mark, so get your last questions. Am I a Churchill lover? Churchill is a very impressive man. I would describe myself as a Churchill lover. Reading his autobiography was really inspirational for me. I read it when I was a teenager, or in my early teens, and just he accomplished so much. And it was just deeply impressive just how continually driven he was and how much he accomplished in a single day. And I try to live my life under Churchillian dictates, where Churchill said, it's not what you do. It's not your level of skill or intelligence. It's how much you do in a single day. And so Churchill had this whole life strategy that was very smart, where he would write 2,000 words a day, which is something I do. But between putting a lot of work out, he would relax, but he would do productive relaxes that would allow his minds to recharge. So he would do bricklaying, he would do painting, and that's what I do. I try to, when I rest, I try to rest productively so that I can come back to my work and what I do with a relaxed and more controlled conscience. And I mean, Churchill, he's just an unbelievably brave figure in that he stood against the narratives that the society demanded of him, but they were still right, and he saved his society, basically. I mean, he knew that Hitler was evil. Well, the dominant narrative was that we'll never fight a war again. Well, he knew that the tank would save the war. Well, the dominant thing at the time was still that cavalry was the dominant arm, and that if you fought without cavalry, you were screwed. Least favorite historical politician? I would say I'm largely Celtic ancestry, so I go with Vortigern. Vortigern was the guy that invited the Anglo-Saxons over to the UK, and then he didn't pay them, so the Anglo-Saxons took over the eastern part of England. Just Vortigern's dictionary definition of a dumbass. I have never read Mary Beard's SPQR. It's on my list, definitely. Favorite communist figure? Khrushchev. Khrushchev's a good guy. He did the best he could to renovate the Soviet Union, to make it a humane system. He was just, the way he survived in Stalin's system was just so deeply oppressive. And I mean, he rose from being the son of a potato farmer, to leading one of the greatest countries on earth, or largest countries on earth. And that's just, yeah, I mean, you gotta love Khrushchev. Biggest missed opportunity in history. The big thing you would say here is heroes invented the steam engine around the birth of Christ, but the Greek social system was designed so that he couldn't capitalize on that. Again, I'd go with my previous, I would go with either China or Islam's divorce from empire and technology around 1200. How the two of them purposely made it so that technology and technological growth was not encouraged. And I think hundreds of millions of people could have lived better lives if Islam had gone with a rational theological school, and if China had been able to have an industrial revolution in the 12th century. What's my quarantine reading list? Okay, so I read a lot, and the book I'm currently reading is Azargat's War. And it's a really interesting anthropological book about how war basically determines what you do in history and your stage of historical development. And before that, I read Carol Quigley's Evolution of Civilizations, which is a very interesting book about the rise and fall of civilizations and the cycles civilizations go through, and that I think it's good in the abstract, but at the same time, if you actually try to apply it to a historic civilization, your chances of success are not that high. And before that, I've been reading quite a bit of Michael Moorcock. He is a fantasy writer. I've been reading a lot of the Witcher books. I love the Witcher books. They're incredible fantasy. I was reading Ian Morris's Farmers, Foragers, Fuel that I was telling you about. I was reading Fernand Braudel's The Identity of France, which is a cultural history of France. I read an anarchist history of the founding of agriculture that was very good. So, I mean, I could go on. Do you think Islam is a good religion to follow? I mean, all religions have beauty inside them, and if you follow your religion to improve the world and to help the people around you and to get in touch with God and the greater truth, I think that's beautiful. And whether you're Buddhist, whether you're Muslim, whether you're Hindu, if you're doing religion for those reasons, then it's good. Yoav Kogan keeps on asking, what if the Arabs won the 6-Day War? And hello from Israel. He's asked that 100 times in the comments, so I guess I should answer. I would say you'd basically get rid of Israel, and the Israeli Jews would migrate in a large section to, I'd say, the United States. You might see a situation like in the Yiddish Policemen's Union, or whatever that book's called. It wouldn't help the Arab world at all, because the Arabs dislike Israel because Israel's a representation of all their own personal failures. And so the second they get rid of Israel, they would just start feuding with each other, because they would need an external opponent to justify their own failures. So 3 more minutes, guys. I'm not going to answer another what if question, so. Favorite Civil War figures. Okay, so I have ancestors who fought for the Union and the Confederacy. And so I support the Union because I'm from Pennsylvania. I'm a Yankee. I don't like slavery. So I would say, this is going to be a really loaded answer. I'm going to get a lot of shit for this, but I have great respect for Robert E. Lee. He was a man of great personal honor. He fought for an evil cause, but he was a good general. Ulysses S. Grant was a deeply hardworking, respectful figure. He failed so many times in his life, but each time he was able to get back up on his horse and try again. And so I have great respect for Ulysses S. Grant. Hooker, great name. Yeah, I'd say those are my big ones. Favorite kind of ice cream? I would say, chocolate chip banana, whenever that's being made. Thoughts about education system. So I think the education system is behind in many different ways. I think that it's more based upon designing for a factory system than promoting rational debate and thought. And so we should develop an educational system that prepares our citizens more to be in a democracy where they have to be thoughtful citizens. And so I think that's a big failing in the US. Like in the US, they don't teach geography or civics in a lot of different situations, which is disastrous because American voters are making decisions of the whole world. And so you need to be able to know where Kazakhstan is to know whether or not to bomb it. And at the same time, I think that people need to be taught to be able to debate rationally, to get their thoughts out, and to remove emotion from politics and decision making, because we're currently in an emotionally laden political climate where it just decides going rah, this different side's going rah 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 rah, and not actually accomplishing anything, and that's highly destructive. And so that's no good. And at the same time, I think that we need to teach more basic life skills. We need to teach kids how to pay taxes. We need to teach kids what to look for in toxic relationships. We need to teach kids how to study effectively, how to prevent themselves from procrastinating, all that stuff. Okay, so one last question. Okay. Novo Christopher seems to be quite intent on what's my favorite empire from the last 200 years. This is my last question, guys. So I'm of part British descent, so part of me wants to say the British Empire. I'm throwing the United States out. The British Empire did a lot of bad things. So I might go with Empire last 200 years. I honestly don't think I can answer that. I'm going to take another last question. Last question, guys. I'm taking one last question. What's my favorite animal? I like the bear. When I was hiking the Appalachian Trail, I ran into bears 4 times. We just looked at each other, knew each other's existence, then we minded our own business. Bears are lovely creatures. I mean, they're very peaceful. They're mostly doing their own thing and living their lives. If I could take any large mammal to a bar, it would be a bear. I mean, yeah. It's funny, a lot of people are terrified of bears, but in general, if you leave them alone, usually as North American bears, if you leave bears alone, they'll leave you alone. They're majestic creatures. They're gorgeous. Okay. Eric Barnabas Arato demands I ask another question, and I'm a pushover, so I'll I'm an undercover Russian agent. You found me out, of course. What was the Appalachian Trail like? So I'll stop on that one. That seems like a good question. Ooh, someone wants to ask you why the West is failing. I'll have to do another one of these soon. So, okay, Appalachian Trail. This is what I'm ending on. So, it was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. It was absolutely brutal. People like to glorify nature. Nature is beautiful, but it's a harsh mistress. And so at the same time, it was the most character growing thing I have ever done. And so the Appalachian Trail, basically after that, nothing else in my life seems terrifying. And I lost so much fear because of that. And just the people on the trail are the nicest you'll ever meet. Hikers are wonderful people. The people in those towns are so nice, so warm. Like, I just met this lady under a bridge when I was camping under a bridge, and she took me in for 2 days. And that was just so nice. And these towns will just let you shower in their gyms for free. And I mean, it was so beautiful and allowed me to reflect upon my life. And so I would never, even though the Appalachian Trail was so hard, I nearly died a couple times. I lived off ramen for weeks on end. Even with all of that, I would never give it up because I learned so much about myself and about life and about existence, basically. So that's it. Thanks, guys. I really enjoyed this. I'd like to do another stream. So maybe in a few weeks or something, I'll be back at this again. Thank you so much. I love you all as my fans. Thanks for the support, even when my mic sucks. And have a great one. Thanks.